What is good, YouTube? A little bit different of a video today, guys, but we're gonna get into the 3 biggest lessons that I learned from falling off as a barber, right? And how you guys can avoid these mistakes and actually build momentum, right? And not get set back, right? And just end up wasting time getting comfortable, because we all know comfort is the biggest killer of growth. And I'm sure if you guys are watching this video, you guys are actually serious about growing. You guys aren't just, doom scrollers, doom broaders. You guys are really serious about taking your business, to the next level. And so that's what this video is for. If you guys are like me and you're looking to grow and get better every day, right, make sure you guys watch it till the end, because I'm gonna be going over again the 3 biggest mistakes, what it cost me, and how to avoid them so that this doesn't happen to you on your barber journey, right? Let's go ahead and get straight into it without further ado. So there was pretty much like 3 big times I can think of pretty much in the last year or so, maybe a little bit over a year in my barber career, where I just completely fell off. I lost myself, and honestly I just stopped gaining momentum, right? And I would get to these big numbers, I would get to my goals, and then after reaching my goals I would just fall off and just become the worst version of myself. I would start just making terrible progress, just reverting back to like old bad habits and just stuff that didn't move the needle in the business. It was quite the opposite, right? I went from having 10k months, saving up a ton of money in the bank, to just almost nearly losing it all because I wasn't being careful about what I was doing in my business, right? A lot of barbers think that the goal is just to hit 10k one time, right? A lot of people think the goal of business is to make money, but really the goal of business is to stay in business, right? There's a difference between getting rich and building wealth, and I'm sure a lot of you guys understand that correlation, right? Again, the goal of business is to stay in business. That means building systems, building something that's sustainable for you and that you can consistently make. You don't just want to hit a 10k month, be a one-hit wonder and fall off and not know how you got your success, right? The ones that really continue scaling, right, they know how they got successful and then they double down, versus the ones who just fall off, they have no idea how they got their success, so they attribute it to luck, and then they just they just fizzle out, right? And that's the worst thing that can happen to you if you're actively trying to grow and get to the top 1% of barbers, or even just become an above average barber, or become the best version of yourself, right? So mistake number 1, where did it happen? Where did we go wrong? Well, let me take you guys back to my senior year of high school, where I was a barber booked out at $40, getting 100 new clients a month, booked out weeks in advance, right? I thought I was on top of the world, but what I ended up doing was I got into my first mentorship program, right? And I was really looking to grow, right? I thought I had it all figured out on my own. Turns out we didn't, but eventually got to the point where I had to raise my prices to $60 a haircut, right? And I was pretty comfortable at the $40 price point. My entire barber career, I had been posting content and it was getting me decent results, right? I was used to being that booked out barber, that's always having a busy schedule and a ton of clients, right? But what happened when I started raising my prices? Well, I got really cocky, right? I thought I was on top of the world, especially being a senior, about to start charging $60. And the biggest thing was I stopped spending so much time on my business. Now, everyone knows like life can get in the way, right? Like life can get distracting, but I mean, it's no excuse, right? Because I literally stopped, each thing is like a different level, right? Each price is a different level. So you can't just, climb up to this level, announce your price raise. I know you get a lot of dopamine, right? I got a lot of dopamine from announcing my price raise. Like it felt good, it felt like I was on top of the world. People were hating, but people were also congratulating, and I was just excited, make a ton of money. The issue came when I started to develop like this ego, right? I started to feel like I was better than, and it came and hit me the first day of the actual price raise being in effect, because I was so used to being booked out. And I remember I went, I picked up my phone and I opened up my calendar, and I had, usually Saturday I'm doing 10 haircuts, right? On this Saturday in particular, I had 3 people booked, and in my mind I'm just disgusted. I'm like, how does this happen? I was like, this isn't me. I'm the guy that has really high standards. Like, how could I allow this to happen, right? And right, so the main issue came, like, everything that I did to get to that $60 price, the grind, right? I stopped putting in that level of effort, right? I was, just completely in a situation where, I had stopped being intentional with what I was doing in my business, and it cost me, right? I went on autopilot, right? The weeks leading up to the price raise being effective, I went on autopilot. I thought that this was all figured out, but as most things are, right, we don't see the repercussions of our actions, the day of. We see them 2 or 3 weeks down the line of consistently, putting in bad or mediocre inputs, right? At first, nothing changed, right? But then again, like my schedule went from 10 cuts to like 3 cuts, and I was sick. All the barbers were clowning me, saying I shouldn't have raised my prices, right? And like it literally looked like they were right, but I knew deep down that this wasn't the case. I knew deep down down that this wasn't a pricing issue. This was a Bristol issue. This was an input issue, right? I had gone wrong somewhere. I knew I was capable of more. And I knew I just made a mistake, right? And so I had to fix this issue that I had. Sometimes we make mistakes, right? But we don't dig ourselves into a rut. Later on, this is just mistake number one. I fixed pretty quick. Later on, you guys are going to see where I actually got myself into a rut, which is really hard to get out of in business, and it's not where you want to be. Again, the daily inputs compound, because slacking, it doesn't hurt you today, but 2-3 weeks down the line of consistently slacking on inputs is going to come back to hurt you. It's going to come back to bite you. And then you're going to be left wondering where you went wrong, right? So what did I do to get myself out of the situation? Because it seems like I seemingly had raised prices at the wrong time, but I knew deep down this wasn't the case. So how did I get out of this, right? I completely stopped focusing on the output, right? I completely stopped focusing on how booked out I was, how much views, my videos were getting, other than like analytics, like, learning what I could have done better. But I wasn't worried about how much money I was making anymore. I wasn't worried about how many cuts I was doing. I was just worried about hitting the basic inputs every day that had got me up until that point. And then once I got back there, I started innovating again, right? Every single day I was moving with intentionality. I was getting better. I was innovating in my content and my business, and I was just making sure I did the 1 to 2 things that would actually move the needle in the business and actually push the business forward and get me back closer to where I wanted to be, right? And you know what happened after this? I went from my slowest week ever as a barber, the least amount of cuts I'd ever done since like charging $5, to the next month, right? Or literally the same month, actually. I think the price was effective at the start of the month. So what ended up happening was the end of the month, I looked back on a whole month of just inputs, and what ended up happening was I hit my first 10K month, because at the end of the month I had got, in the TikTok creator program, I got paid. I went to sleep one night and I woke up the next morning to thousands of dollars a check from TikTok, right? And I was just mind blown. And this is where all started to click for me what was possible. And safe to say, after that, I never allowed my standards to dip down so low, to where I made less than 10K a month, because I had learned my lesson. But this is where the next issue starts, because as soon as I got comfortable again, I fell back into this trap later on, right? Because I was smart enough not to go into the price raise with the ego, right? I acted like the second price raise never happened, but the next fall off came when I raised my prices to 85, because I was chilling at $60. I was making over 10K a month. We were hitting probably like 11, 12 at this point, right? And I was comfortable, like like everything was just coming together, right? I would get paid crazy amounts of money off TikTok. I had my first $1,000 days, right? And I just felt like I was on top of the world. I thought I was him. I just got to a point where I didn't even start checking in, right? I stopped moving the needle again. I stopped growing. I got so comfortable at being booked out at 60 and hitting these big numbers, over 10K per month, getting paid on TikTok. I thought it would last forever, right? And all the stuff that I had done to get up to that point, right, it stopped working, because the thing with content is that the market's always changing, right? What worked 6 months ago, right, it's not going to work, today to the same degree. And so I thought that, I didn't have to keep up with the market, essentially, because I was already booked out. And that came back to bite me, because what had I done? When I stopped innovating again, right, and I stopped keeping up with the market, it came back to hurt me. So I stopped getting new clients, right? But it really wasn't an issue, like I was still booked out. The issue came when I realized that I had stagnated, right? I had stopped growing. I was at my max potential for the $60 price point, because I was hitting, booked out weeks and months, and I couldn't make any more money than I was already making. So I had to face a decision. Do I want to risk, growth? Do I want to get uncomfortable and actually get to the next level? Or do I just want to be making 12K a month for the rest of my life, right? And most people, they would be, chilling. They would love to be making 12K a month. I'm just the type of person who was never satisfied, right? And I always wanted to raise standards, and I always wanted to charge $100. That was my thing. So of course I'm not going to stop when I'm only charging 60, even if it means risking the stability of being booked out. We always got to take that risk. We always got to move the needle. And this was the hardest risk for me to take, right? Because I jumped on the call. My mentor told me I was a cut to go from $60 to $85 a cut. I just remember being sick. It was like, bro, I'm not ready for this. I think he'd originally told me to go to 90, and I negotiated down to 85. I didn't have the drive, but I knew that the number one way so I was going to progress was to put myself into an uncomfortable situation. And I also knew that eventually I'd have to raise my prices, right? So better now while I have the momentum going than wait and get even more comfortable, right? Better now than never. And the price raise for 85 went pretty smoothly. I didn't make the same mistakes that I made when going up to 60. And so I didn't really lose a ton of clientele, and I stayed really booked out, and I started hitting big months, right? $85 a cut is when I hit my first, I think it was 13.5, and then $15,000 month off of cutting. But this is when everything started to go downhill for me, because at this point I was so comfortable, right? I had just started my freshman year of college. I was making $85 a cut, booked out, $15,000 a month, right? More than I would have ever been making from any college career. And it's like, I just thought I was on top of the world, right? I was 18 years old. I was making well over 15K a month. As I said, I was getting paid by TikTok in my sleep. I was getting paid almost $1,000 a month just off brand deals to promote products. And I thought that, I could do no wrong, right? So what did I start doing? Well, like, I've never been the type of person that really lets myself go, right? I never gone, too far in terms of like, just bad habits, because, I always avoided those, right? And I got rid of those, right? But I did get distracted, and I lost the focus that I had from before, right? And so it was easy to feel invincible, right? I just didn't have priorities. I remember I would always go out to eat at like nice restaurants. And the number one downfall for me was that I stopped tracking my finances, right? I just completely ignored my finances. No longer did I know how much I was bringing in every day. No longer did I know how much I was spending, which was a silent killer, right? Because like the whole goal is for us to make more money as barbers, but for us to keep the money, right? What had happened was I was a victim of lifestyle inflation, right? Where I had increased my income, but I had increased my expenses so high that I was literally taking home the same amount every single month to put away for investments and saving as I did when I was charging 60, even though I was charging 85. And I fell into the cycle again of going through the motions, right? Getting comfortable, losing intentionality, losing direction, right? Because in my mind, I was so close to that 100 that it was just any day now that I'd be charging 100. I didn't really have to worry about anything, right? I basically thought I had already made it once again. And to me, comfort is worse than failing, right? So then what broke me out of this, right, is that I decided to take some huge risks. Everyone was calling me crazy. Everyone was telling me, why would I do this, right? Why would I leave this comfort that I had built up, this stability that I built up behind to chase even more, right? And it's because I knew that I was comfortable. I knew that I was in a bad spot. So what did I do, right? Despite having my expenses already being high, I decided to move out to a different city, right? About 40 minutes from where I currently stayed. I moved, I got my own place, moved out of my parents' house as soon as I turned 19, and to a pretty expensive spot as well, because I knew that, having to pay those bills would make me uncomfortable, right? It would kind of shock me, wake me up and actually get me into the state where I knew that I had to take my life more serious, especially my finances, right? I couldn't be just BSing, blowing my money, coming home, staying up late, when I lived on my own, or so I had thought, right? I took on the bills and the responsibilities that would force me to grow despite just having turned 19 years old. And that was at the start of this year, right? I moved shops 40 minutes away later on, one of the hardest decisions I'd done, because I was so scared to lose the stability that I had built up. But I knew it had to be done in order to, realign everything with the way I had planned it out to live my dream life, right? And one mindset shift that really helped me start making these hard decisions was like the cost of staying in the same place was way bigger of a fear of mine than the cost of never achieving the goals, right? Because I'd always wanted to, move out. I think I originally, decided to move out because I knew that my biggest fear was the responsibility of living on my own. And so I knew that, okay, that's my biggest fear. Now my number one goal should be to conquer my biggest fear. I have to move out, right? I have to do this. And so it worked out, but this ended up being like, a third trap along the way, right? We moved shops, we did all that, but eventually again we stopped moving the needle. This was around when I started taking cash flow barbers really seriously, right? I started pouring into the mentorship every single day, but we were also charging $100, and I just really didn't have a lot of direction, which is strange because most people would think that this is like the peak. Now I'm at 15K months, right? I'm cutting like 3 to 4 days a week. I have my own place, right? And everyone's really now, they're just hammering it in that I have made it, right? There is no upper ceiling to go. And, everyone's telling me like, just enjoy life, right? Just be, just enjoy yourself. You live on your own. Just enjoy the fruits of your labor, right? Enjoy what you've built. And I think a lot of people had a valid point, right? But the main issue came was like, I had nothing to do. I had no purpose, right? I had no drive, no growth, because I started to buy into this idea that I had made it personally in my journey, right? At this point, we were hitting consistent 15K months, right? I was able to kind of cut back on some time on the chair. And although I was putting it into cash flow barbers, right? At the same time, like it just really, I didn't have a big goal with cash flow barbers in terms of like growing the business, right? And that's what I love, growing businesses, right? And so I was fulfilling the client clients, right, I was helping you guys get like, 2-3 extra income on your prices. But for me, right, I wasn't seeing the reflection of that within my own business because I was neglecting, growing myself. Everyone was telling me I made it, right? Everyone was telling me I was living in the dream, but inside I felt like a bum. I was one of those gym bums, the people that go to the gym like twice a day. I would wake up early, go to the gym, stay up late. I know it's not a bad problem to have, but I would spend almost 3 or 4 hours a day working out, lifting weights in the gym. I would eat out multiple times a day, every single day, right? And just blow my money on food, continue to blow my money on eating out, right? I would sleep in 12 hours, stay up late, wake up whenever I wanted because I felt like I could. Right. But at the end of the day, right, I knew that this wasn't me because I had ended up maintaining and not growing. And for the first 6 months, that was my reality. I was living in such a cycle of comfort that I literally completely lost sight of the hungry, ambitious, driven side of myself that wanted to get 1% better every day. Right. I was just maintaining. I was just cruising. I was just on autopilot. I was getting really strong in my faith too at this point, right, as a Christian, and everything was good there. But like in terms of my personal life and the business side of things, I just wasn't, I didn't have that hunger anymore. I wasn't setting big goals and I wasn't growing. My wake up call came when I took the first vacation I had taken in years, and it was a family vacation where I went with my whole family, right? And I realized that I had already been on vacation the entire year, right? It felt the same, right? It literally felt like nothing had changed because I had been on vacation all year. There was no growth, right? There was just coasting. And so at this vacation, I had a night, right? And I had to sit down. I had to reevaluate everything, right? New budget, right? New goals, new strategy, new direction of who BDB is, right? Who Bristol is, where am I going to be by the end of the year? Because I had promised myself these big goals back in December when I turned 19, and I watched the old video that I promised myself, right? And I watched the notes that I had taken where I wrote down my goals, and I realized this might be the first time ever where I've written down goals and I'm not on pace to achieve them by the end of the year, right? Because we're already 6 months into the year. I asked myself, I said, when was I the hungriest? I thought back to when I first started charging $60 a cut, and I said, how can I recreate that version of myself now, right? How can I become the version of myself that I was back then, where I was so focused on getting better every day? And I realized how different he was back then to who I am now, right? The version of me back then was waking up at 5, 6 a.m., right, and just moving the needle as soon as he woke up, right? And just like every day, just the grind, getting 1% better, saying no to everything that didn't align with my goal, right? I was obsessed. I was dreaming about it, right? And here's the truth, right? Success with growth feels like failure, because if you're a person that likes to grow, right, you're gonna eventually get to the point where it just doesn't feel right to stay stagnant. That's why you see all these people like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos starting new companies and new companies. It's not because they need the money. It's just because it does something to you when you're one of those types of people that just is hungry for it, right? And you love growing, you love the grind, you love the game. Building that momentum and just having it killed, it does something to you, right? Momentum comes from daily inputs, daily actions, right? Actually getting better, right? And the number one killer of hunger is comfort. Basically, if you're not growing, right, you're falling off. Or Mosley talks about this concept because if you're not growing the business every year, there's no such thing as maintaining, right? If you're not growing the business every year, you're falling off. Yes, you can build systems, but if you're not growing, right, you're losing, you're dying. Either you're growing or you're dying. This Q4, right, everyone's talking about the great lock-in or whatever, but it's not too late to actually do something. And like my main message to this video was, I want you guys to be like me, right? I want you guys to look at the goals you set for yourself, and if you honestly feel like you're not on track to hit them, reevaluate yourself, right? Reevaluate who you are, what you're doing with your business. Was there a time where you were more hungry, right? Was there a time when you were really driven and really getting better every month, right? And just going crazy and just crazy improvement, and have you slowed down, right? Because we've all gone through this, but the biggest step is, admitting that we've slowed down, we've gotten comfortable, right? If you're not on pace for your goals, right, take accountability, make a change, right? Do the 1 or 2 things a day that are actually going to benefit you, and move the needle forward. Because life feels so much better when you actually wake up every day and do the things that you needed to do. That's how you kill anxiety, right? I used to always have this anxiety in the back of my mind that I wasn't doing the right thing. It's because I knew I wasn't doing what I needed to do. Doing the 1 to 2 things that move the needle every day are going to build momentum, right? They're going to create growth, and they're going to kill your comfort. You guys already know what it is, man. If you guys are stuck, need help, Q4, man, book a link in the bio, right? Book a one-on-one call with us and see how we can help you break past your plateau.